I remember this night like it was yesterday, even though I am 26 years old now, and this happened all the way back when I was only 12. It is funny how certain moments from your childhood can just burn themselves into your memory. And no matter how much time passes, you can still feel that exact same knot of cold fear in your stomach. On this particular night, my parents were heading out for the evening. They left me home with my 18-year-old brother, Zach. At first, I was actually pretty excited about it. When you are 12, being left in a big house feels like this massive wave of freedom. It felt like I was finally being trusted, like I was growing up. But almost as soon as my parents pulled out of the driveway, Zach turned to me with this serious look on his face. He told me that he was going to head out for a few hours to hang out with some of his friends. He made me promise, absolute promise, that I would not say a single word to our mom and dad. I didn't hesitate. I agreed immediately because I trusted him, and honestly, why wouldn't I want the entire place to myself? Zach knew he would get into a massive amount of trouble if our parents found out he had left a 12-year-old home alone, so we had this unspoken bond of keeping the secret. At first, it really did feel like fun. I was completely on my own on a weekend night, which was a rare treat. I ended up wandering down to the den on the lower level of the house. I figured it was the perfect time to watch a scary movie, since nobody was around to tell me to turn it off. Looking back, that was probably the worst decision I could have made, and I ended up learning that lesson the hard way. I had never actually been left completely home alone for this long before, especially not in the pitch black of night. About halfway through the movie, the screen got dark, and that is when the fear started to creep in. It was not even because of what was happening on the television screen. It was because of the house itself. When a big house gets completely empty, it starts to make all these strange, unfamiliar noises. I started noticing every single little sound. There were these random creaks in the floorboards upstairs. The wind outside was brushing the tree branches against the window glass with this rhythmic, scratching sound. Even the kitchen refrigerator would click periodically, and in the silence it sounded incredibly loud. Every time the movie had a jump scare or a loud swell of music, I would flinch. My heart would start pounding, and I would find myself looking over my shoulder. Behind the couch where I was sitting, there was a half flight of stairs that led up to the main floor of the house. Every single time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing there at the top of the stairs, just staring down at me in the dark. Eventually, it got to be too much. I could not take the tension anymore, and I realized I was just torturing myself for no reason. I grabbed the remote, shut off the television, and ran up those stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. I felt like a little kid running away from imaginary monsters the second the lights go out. I bolted straight into my bedroom and closed the door. My bedroom was connected to my parents' bedroom by a shared bathroom. I ran into that bathroom, locked the door leading to my parents' room, and started brushing my teeth as fast as I could. I was trying desperately to calm myself down, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. After I finished, I went back into my bedroom and decided to turn on my Xbox 360 to play Call of Duty Zombies. I figured that playing a game where I was actively shooting things would make me feel a lot less helpless and a lot less scared. I ended up getting completely lost in the game. I played for a few hours, totally losing track of the time, but eventually, my team and I died on a high round of zombies, and I got frustrated. I looked at the clock and realized how late it had gotten. I decided it was time to call it a night and try to get some sleep. I climbed into bed and turned off the lights. It was not long after that when I felt a faint vibration run through the floorboards. It was the distinct feeling of the heavy front door downstairs closing. I immediately relaxed, assuming it was Zach finally coming back home from hanging out with his friends. I lay there in the dark, listening, expecting to hear his usual routine. But then, things started to feel a little bit off. Usually, when Zach came home late, he would walk straight up the stairs and go directly into his bedroom to avoid making noise. But this time, the sounds were staying downstairs, and they were going on for far too long. I could hear these subtle, quiet footsteps moving around on the lower level. There were these strange, indescribable thumps and thuds that did not make any sense. My stomach started to churn. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the scary movie had gotten into my head. I got out of bed and crept over to my window to look down at the driveway. I expected to see Zach's car parked in his usual spot, but when I looked out, the driveway was completely empty. His car was not there. That was the exact moment when real cold panic set in. I was only 12 years old, and back then I did not have a cell phone. I had absolutely no way to contact my parents or Zach without leaving my bedroom and going to one of the landline phones in the house. But the thought of stepping out of my room into that dark hallway felt completely impossible. I quietly tiptoed over to my bedroom door. I checked the lock to make sure it was secure, but as I stared at the little lock on the handle, I realized something terrifying. It was one of those cheap privacy locks that you could easily unlock from the outside with just a fingernail or a flat piece of metal. If someone was out there and wanted to get in, that lock was not going to stop them. I looked around my room, desperately searching for a place to hide. My eyes landed on the small crawlspace closet that was built directly into the wall of my room. It was tiny, but I knew I could fit. I opened the door, squeezed myself inside, and shut the door behind me as quietly as I possibly could. I sat there in the pitch black, curled up, trying to control my breathing. I kept praying that I was just being paranoid. I thought that maybe Zach had parked his car on the side of the house instead of the driveway. But just a few seconds later, I heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. They were slow and deliberate. Then I heard someone fumbling with my bedroom door handle. Within seconds, the door clicked and it swung open. Someone was inside my bedroom. I had absolutely no idea who it was, what they looked like, or what they wanted. I stayed completely frozen in that tiny closet, holding my breath. I could hear their footsteps moving around on the carpet. Every time they took a step, the floorboards creaked under their weight. I could hear things in my room being shifted and moved around. Every second felt like an eternity. I was terrified that at any moment the closet door would swing open and I would be face to face with an intruder. I still desperately hoped it was just Zach playing some kind of sick joke, but I knew deep down it wasn't. At one point, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. It made my heart feel like it was going to burst out of my chest. It felt like hours had passed, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I heard the footsteps move out of my room and recede down the hallway. Even though the room was quiet, I did not dare to move. I stayed hidden in that dark closet for what felt like forever, probably close to 2 full hours. I was too terrified to even stretch my legs. But then, the silence was broken by the sound of Zach's voice, calling my name from the other side of the house. He sounded incredibly urgent and really pissed off. A few moments later, he walked into my bedroom and called my name again. I finally pushed the closet door open and stepped out. The very first thing Zach did was start yelling at me. He asked me what the hell I was doing in the closet, and why I had completely trashed his room. That was the moment that confirmed everything. It had not been Zach in the house. I explained the situation to him as fast as I could, my voice cracking and my hands shaking uncontrollably. Once Zach realized I was telling the truth, his anger turned to pure shock. We started looking around the house together, and that is when we realized how bad it actually was. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped onto the floor. Our electronics were gone. The television in the living room was missing, and our gaming consoles had been unplugged and taken. Someone had systematically gone through our home and stolen everything of value. Zach immediately called the police, and we stood by the door, completely on edge, checking every window to make sure the intruder was gone. The police arrived a short while later and took a full report, writing down everything that had been stolen. They told us to wait inside until our parents got home. Around 4 in the morning, my mom and dad finally arrived. My dad was absolutely furious. As soon as he walked through the door and realized what had happened, he went straight for Zach and smacked him right across the face. He was angry that Zach had been so careless, leaving a 12-year-old home alone with the front door completely unlocked. My mom, on the other hand, just rushed over to me, pulled me into a tight hug, and said she was just glad I was safe. Zach was punished severely. He was forced to pay monthly rent from that point on to slowly pay back the cost of all the stolen electronics. I was not punished at all, but the experience completely changed me. For years, I was terrified of being home alone. Even now, at 26, if I hear a strange creak in the night, my mind goes straight back to that tiny closet, listening to the footsteps of a stranger walking around my bedroom. But as terrifying as it is to think about a stranger going through your things while you hide in a closet, there are other kinds of threats that hit much closer to home. Sometimes, the threat is someone you actually know, someone you consider a friend of the family. This next story takes us back to a time when I was very young, not even in kindergarten yet. At the time, I was living with my grandparents in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. My mom and dad had just separated, and my dad was working in the next town over, so I only saw him on the weekends. My uncle, who was my dad's brother, also lived in the house with us. Because of this, I was almost never left completely alone. There was always an adult around to watch over me. Growing up, my grandparents were always very strict about safety. They constantly reminded me to never, under any circumstances, answer the front door for a stranger. It was a peaceful community, but they wanted to make sure I was safe. We had a neighbor who lived just down the road, a man I will call David. He was a regular fixture at our house. He would come over all the time to watch hockey games on the television, watch wrestling matches with my uncle, or join us for family barbecues in the backyard. David was incredibly friendly with both my grandfather and my uncle. He would often have a few beers with my uncle in the garage, and he was always willing to help my grandpa with yard work or fixing up his truck. If my grandpa came home from a hunting trip with a moose, David would be right there to help him haul it into the shed. He was someone we trusted completely. But then, one night, everything changed. I was briefly left home alone. My grandma had gone to a local bingo game, and she had just called the house to ask for a ride back home. My grandpa told me that he was going to drive over to pick her up. He asked me if I wanted to go with him, but I refused because my favorite cartoons were playing on the television, and I did not want to miss them. My grandpa sighed, smiled, and reminded me once again to keep the door locked and to never open it for anyone. Then he walked out and got into his truck. I watched from the window as the headlights swept across the yard and his truck pulled away down the road. As soon as the sound of the engine faded, the house got incredibly quiet. It was just me and the sound of the television playing in the living room. But only a few minutes after my grandpa left, there was a loud, sudden knock on the front door. I jumped up and ran over to the door. Remembering my grandparents' rules, I did not open it. Instead, I called out as loud as I could, asking who was there. To my relief, a familiar voice answered from the other side. It was David. He called out his name and said he wanted to come inside. I told him through the closed door that my grandparents were not home. David replied immediately, saying that he knew they weren't, because he had just seen my grandpa's truck driving away down the road. I then told him that my uncle was not home either. David responded by saying that he had actually just been talking to my uncle on the phone, so he knew my uncle was out drinking at a friend's house. Then, David asked me to open the door and let him in. I hesitated. I told him that I was not allowed to open the door for strangers. But David laughed and said that he was not a stranger. He was our neighbor, someone I had known my entire life. In my young mind, his logic made perfect sense. He was a friend. He was not a stranger. But I still could not understand why he wanted to come inside when there were no other adults home. Despite that lingering doubt, I reached up, unlocked the lock, and opened the heavy wooden door. David was standing on the porch, and he towered over me. It was immediately obvious that he was heavily intoxicated. He was swaying back and forth, slurring his words, and squinting at me with one eye. He stepped across the threshold, and immediately placed both of his heavy hands onto my shoulders. I backed up a step, but I did not feel alarmed just yet. I was used to seeing my uncle and his friends drink, so a drunk adult did not inherently scare me. I politely told David that he could go wait in the kitchen while I went back to watch my cartoons. But David did not let go. His grip on my shoulders tightened, and his demeanor changed in an instant. The friendly look on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of pure anger. He started saying things to me in a low, threatening voice. I was so young that I cannot remember the exact words he used, but I will never forget the sheer terror those words put into my heart. He dragged me by my shoulders into the kitchen. He reached over to the counter and grabbed a large, sharp kitchen knife. He pressed the cold, sharp tip of the blade directly against my stomach. He looked down at me and asked me if I wanted to be stabbed. I burst into tears, terrified for my life. But when I started crying, David grew even angrier. He told me to shut up, warning me that if I made another sound, he would cut my tongue out or slit my throat. To show me that he was serious, he dragged the cold, dull side of the blade slowly across my throat. I was frozen, unable to even breathe. But then, the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway broke the silence. I heard the distinct sound of car doors slamming shut outside. A wave of pure relief flooded through me, and I opened my mouth to scream for help. But before I could make a sound, David's large hand clamped down hard over my mouth, suffocating my scream. He turned us both toward the kitchen doorway, just as the front door opened. My grandma walked into the house with a smile on her face, but that smile vanished the instant her eyes landed on the kitchen. She saw David holding me hostage with a massive knife pressed against my throat. She let out a blood-curdling scream, yelling for my grandpa to get inside immediately. My grandpa rushed through the door, and when he saw what was happening, a look of shock and pure fury washed over his face. He did not hesitate for a single second. He charged forward, screaming at David with a level of rage I had never heard before. David panicked and shoved me hard onto the kitchen floor. My grandma rushed over, grabbed me in her arms, and held me tightly against her chest, blocking my view so I could not see what was happening. She kept whispering that I was safe, but I could still hear the violent struggle taking place just feet away. My grandpa was a strong man, and he quickly overpowered David. When my grandma finally let me look up, I saw my grandpa shoving David out of the front door, screaming at him to never come back, before slamming the door shut and locking it. As I grew up and thought back to that night, I realized something incredibly chilling. David had planned the entire thing. He had waited in the shadows, watching our house. He knew my uncle was out drinking. He knew my grandma was at bingo. And he waited until he saw my grandpa's truck pull away before he made his move. He knew I would be completely alone. I was too young to understand what his ultimate intentions were, but it is clear they were deeply sinister. Years later, after my grandpa passed away, I was sitting with my grandma, talking about old memories. I brought up that terrifying night, and talked about how heroic my grandpa had been. But my grandma looked incredibly uneasy. She agreed that it was a horrific night, but then she asked me if I remembered that my grandpa had gone out hunting that very same night, right after the incident. I faintly remembered him leaving, even though hunting at night was not something he ever did, unless he was planning a long camping trip. When I asked her why he went hunting so late, my grandma suddenly became very quiet and claimed she did not remember much else about that night. It got me thinking. My grandparents never called the police to report what David had done. They never pressed charges. And after that night, David was never seen or heard from again. My grandpa was highly respected in our small community. He was close friends with several local police officers, and they went to the same church together. He was also known as an expert hunter. If anyone had seen a bloody tarp in the back of his truck as he drove out of town in the middle of the night, nobody would have ever questioned it. It is one thing when a threat comes from a neighbor you thought you could trust. But it is a completely different kind of nightmare when the danger comes from a friend you have known for years. This next story took place a few years ago during spring break in 2020. I was 15 years old at the time, and I was home alone one evening while my parents were out of town. I was just hanging out in my bedroom, relaxing, when my phone started to ring. I looked down and saw that the call was from a mutual friend of mine, from school named Mason. Now Mason and I were not close. We rarely ever talked, and we almost never called or texted each other, so I was pretty surprised to see his name on my screen. But I decided to answer it anyway. Before I could even say hello, Mason spoke up. He asked me what I was doing. I told him that I was just hanging out at home by myself, and wasn't doing much of anything. He immediately asked if he could drop off a buddy of mine, because this guy needed a place to stay for the night. The buddy he was talking about was a guy named Neil, whom I had known since we were in the 3rd grade together. I told Mason that I really did not feel like having company over, I just wanted to chill by myself and have a quiet night. But when I said that, Mason began to practically beg me. I could hear this intense desperation in his voice as he pleaded with me to let him drop Neil off at my house. I was still very reluctant, but then Mason made me an offer. He told me that if I let Neil stay over, he would let me keep his weed pen. I was a stupid 15-year-old kid back then, and that offer was enough to make me cave. I told him they could pull up. Looking back, I realize how incredibly foolish I was to let something so trivial persuade me, especially considering the horror that was about to unfold. But at the time, I just wasn't thinking. Now, Neil had always been an extremely outgoing guy. He was the kind of person who had absolutely no filter and did not care at all what other people thought about him. But the week before this happened, my brother and some of my other friends had mentioned that Neil had started acting really strange in school. I hadn't thought much of it at first. When I asked my brother to explain what he meant, he told me that Neil would randomly start laughing or clapping loudly in the middle of a completely silent classroom. He would also say incredibly bizarre things to people for no apparent reason, like claiming that the school's basketball coaches were actually secret Freemasons who were trying to convert him. After hearing that, I realized Neil was clearly going through something, but it wasn't until he and Mason arrived at my house that I understood just how severe the situation really was. I met them at the front door to greet them. I took a hit from Mason's weed pen as promised and handed it back to him. But as Mason turned to leave, he did something that made me feel very uneasy. He grabbed Neil by the shoulders, looked him dead in the eye, and with tears actually forming in his eyes, he pleaded with Neil not to do that thing. Neil just stared back at him with a completely blank expression. He casually nodded and said that he understood. I really should have asked right then and there what they were talking about. I should have asked what that thing was. But for some reason, I remained silent, and I let Neil walk inside as Mason drove away. The second I closed the front door, Neil turned to me. The very first question he asked was whether every single door in the house was locked. Red flags immediately started screaming in my head. A cold feeling of dread washed over me, and I realized I had just gotten myself into a very dangerous situation. I told Neil that the doors were indeed locked, and I asked him why he was asking. He insisted that we check, so I led him down the narrow hallway near the front door to show him that both the back door and the laundry room door were securely locked. Neil did not say a word as I pointed to the locks. We just stood there in the silence of the hallway for a few seconds. Then, out of nowhere, Neil's hand shot up into the air as if he were raising his hand in class. He turned his face toward me and put on this incredibly eerie, wide, toothy smile. He held that posture, staring at me with that blank, creepy smile for several seconds. Then, without saying a single word, he slowly lowered his arm. I felt my skin crawl. I forced a fake chuckle, trying to play it off and make the situation feel less terrifying. Neil then asked me for a glass of water, so we walked into the kitchen. As I opened the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water, I watched Neil out of the corner of my eye. He was lingering by the counter, right next to the drawer where we kept our silverware, including our sharpest knives. I watched in horror as he slowly reached out, opened the drawer, and reached his hand inside to grab a large steak knife. Instinct took over. Before he could grasp the handle, I ran over, grabbed his wrist, and slammed the drawer shut with all my strength. Neil did not react. He did not flinch or try to pull away. He just stared at me with those vacant eyes and let out a soft chuckle, as if he were trying to pretend it was all just a joke. At that moment, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was frozen in pure, unadulterated fear. It was the kind of primal fear you feel when you realize your life is in immediate danger. I knew I had to get Neil out of my house immediately. Neil broke the silence by suggesting that we go for a walk to the neighborhood park. I agreed instantly, acting as if nothing had happened. We walked toward the laundry room, which led out to the driveway. I made sure to let him walk out of the door first. Once he was outside, I told him I just needed to put my shoes on. He paused, looking subtly disappointed, and told me to hurry up. The second he stepped onto the driveway, I closed the door, locked it, and bolted it shut. I immediately called my brother and explained the situation, my voice trembling. My brother realized the danger I was in and told me he was on his way. Within less than 5 minutes, my brother arrived with 3 of his friends. They found Neil standing outside in the driveway. I finally built up the courage to step outside. My brother and his friends were talking to Neil, who was completely rambling. He was talking nonsense about how the school's basketball coaches were part of the Illuminati, and how they were doing terrible things to the players to make them play better. It was clear he was completely detached from reality. We knew there was no way we could let him stay at my house, so one of my brother's friends offered to drive him home. Neil resisted at first, claiming that he could not go home because his dad was going to kill him. But eventually, they managed to get him into the car and take him away. Once the chaos settled, I called Mason. I was furious. I demanded to know what Neil had said to him in the car that made him act this way. Mason confessed that during the drive over, Neil had been reading aloud from a written manifesto. In that manifesto, Neil wrote that he believed he had to either kill himself or kill someone else to prevent his own father from murdering him. Mason had panicked and, in his desperation to get rid of Neil, decided to dump him at my house. I lost my mind, screaming at Mason for putting my life in danger just to save himself. It was later revealed that Neil had taken some recreational drugs that had triggered a severe, dormant schizophrenic episode, causing him to hear voices. I ended up telling my mother the entire story about a month later, and she was absolutely horrified. I still look back on that night and shudder, realizing how close I came to a tragedy, all because I had paid attention to him in the kitchen. Sometimes, the danger does not wait for an invitation, and it does not give you any warning at all. It just watches you from the shadows of your own home, waiting for the perfect moment to make itself known. This final story begins on a warm, sunny afternoon when I was just 10 years old. My mom was getting ready to go grocery shopping, and she asked me if I wanted to come along with her. I remember making a huge deal out of it, whining and begging her to let me stay home. It was a beautiful day, and all I wanted to do was shoot hoops in the street. I told her that nothing bad could possibly happen in the span of a couple of hours. She finally gave in, smiled, and told me to stay safe before pulling out of the driveway. As soon as her car disappeared down the road, I grabbed my old basketball from the garage and ran out to the hoop we had set up in the street. I spent a long time playing by myself, running back and forth, completely lost in my own world. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath, sweating from the heat. I stood there, lazily bouncing the basketball on the asphalt, looking around the quiet neighborhood. That was when my eyes drifted up toward my house. I looked at the upstairs window, and my heart stopped. Someone was standing behind the glass of my sister's bedroom window, staring down at me. At first it was just a dark shadow, positioned slightly back from the sunlight. I stared at it for a couple of seconds, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But then, the shape shifted slightly. There was no mistake about it. A person was standing inside our house looking right at me. My sister was away at college, my dad was at work, and my mom was at the grocery store. Nobody was supposed to be home. I dropped my basketball, and it bounced away down the street. I bolted toward the back of the house, ran through the gate, and burst through the back door. Slamming it shut behind me, I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding, and yelled up the stairs asking who was home. For a long, agonizing second there was only silence. But then a voice answered from the top of the stairs. It called out, "Rad, come upstairs." It was not my mother's voice, and it was not my sister's. It was a deep voice, but it sounded strange, like a grown man trying to force his voice to sound normal and welcoming. I did not go anywhere near those stairs. I grabbed the house phone off the counter and ran back outside as fast as I could. I called my mom, sobbing, and told her someone was in the house. She did not believe me at first, telling me it was a terrible thing to joke about. But as I kept crying and begging her to come home, she realized I was terrified. She told me she was leaving the store right then. She must have called the police, because a patrol car pulled up to our house at the exact same time my mom's car turned into the driveway. My mom rushed over to me, and I pointed to the upstairs window. The police officers drew their weapons and entered the house first. My mom followed them shortly after, leaving me to wait outside on the sidewalk. I stood there for 10 minutes, staring at that window, but nothing moved. Eventually, an officer came out and told us it was safe to come inside. They had searched every single room, the closets, under the beds, and even the attic. They found absolutely nothing. There was no sign of an intruder. My mom started to look at me with doubt in her eyes. She told me that if she found out I was playing a prank, I would be grounded for wasting police time. I kept crying, insisting I was telling the truth. That night, I had a terrible time trying to fall asleep. The memory of that voice kept playing over and over in my head, but eventually exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I do not know what time it was when I suddenly woke up. It was pitch black in my room. I sat upright in bed, feeling a sudden chill. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I scanned my room. I saw my dresser, my closet door, and then my eyes stopped. Standing just a few feet away from my bed was a tall, dark figure. It was completely still, watching me sleep. I did not even have time to think. A loud, terrified scream ripped out of my throat. The second I screamed, the figure moved with incredible speed. In 2 massive steps, the person reached my window, slid it open, and leaped out onto the small awning below before dropping to the ground. My parents burst into my room seconds later. My dad ran straight to the open window, looked out, and then ran downstairs barefoot to search the yard. But the intruder was already gone. They called the police again, but they found no trace of the man. The most terrifying part of this experience is realizing that the intruder had been hiding inside our home during the day. He had stayed in the house long enough to learn my name, and he had been watching me from the shadows. Whether he remained hidden in the attic or climbed back in through my window, he was standing in my bedroom while I slept, and I will never know what his true intentions were. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.